Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Centered from Reality podcast. This is a podcast with me, Alex Kapitko, where I am just a centrist trying to understand why everything's so crazy. I want to know why, I want to know how, and I know what we can do. I'm currently sitting here in Chicago, Illinois. It's a torrential downpour. I am doing some research on a paper I'm writing, which is about Detroit and decline, and it's honestly not the happiest thing, so I wanted a little break to talk about even less happy things, I guess. That seems to be my thing here on this. But as usual, just be mindful that there could be street noise. It hasn't really been too bad, honestly. But anyways, I'm also still getting over the Ted Lasso season 2 finale. Lots going on there. If you haven't seen the show, honestly watch it. I don't think it's the best show or it's perfect, but there's a lot in it that I really enjoy to see. And there's some twists in there, so I'm still kind of marinating on that, and I figured it's a good time to maybe do an international episode. And there's kind of a general theme in these that I want to talk about, but I want to basically focus on this episode on the CIA report that's come out about how they are losing informants to either death or compromise around the world. I also want to look into what's happening with Taiwan, or the better way to say would be the escalation with Taiwan. And then also talk about Ethiopia and what's going on in that, I guess you could almost say, humanitarian crisis, almost heading into a genocide. So, involving our first topic on the CIA. Recently, when the Biden administration did that chaotic, but I would argue justified withdrawal from Afghanistan, I was on a run one day, and I kind of was thinking about the CIA. Yeah, you can make fun of me for doing that, but I guess that's where my mind went that day. Yada, 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 whatever. When I was young, honestly, being part of the CIA was kind of that dream job that seemed really cool, right? There was something just fascinating about being a clandestine agent, globetrotting, doing undercover work for the USA, being undercover in Cuba, changing the world for the better. I remember Felix Leiter. For those who are not James Bond fans, he was Bond's counterpart who worked for the CIA. He was always cool, helping Bond, toting a fedora, usually, smoking a Cuban cigar, and they always worked together. He seemed cool. And you're like, damn, I want to be that. Of course, like everyone knows, that's the almost propagandized version of what the CIA are. They're cool. They're doing the right thing, and they're always in the right. Unfortunately, ignorance is bliss, and over the years, I kind of have figured out that the CIA isn't really that flashy, and they aren't really that great either. And this is not an episode that I'm just going to bash the CIA or do a roast, because I'm not trying to roast anybody. If I was roasting someone, I'd try to be a comedian and do it somewhere else. But I used to think they were crucial and good and always working to better the world, but the more you learn about the CIA, the more flawed they seem. And this is not a call out to the people that work in there. There's a lot of qualified experts who are just on the ground doing what they think is right and what they know is right, and a lot of the time it is right. But there's a lot of examples, and the more come out every year as we have more access to intelligence, declassified material, etc. And just a few examples, just to kind of give you a picture here, is that they apparently recruited Nazis for help after the fall of the Third Reich, I guess you could say. They funded opposing factions in Nicaragua. There's their involvement in a myriad of South American and East Asian countries in helping authoritarian regimes, as long as they were on the side of the U.S. There's flawed counterintelligence that led to the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. And, of course, there's domestic wiretapping, which I think is more endemic to our entire national security community. But that's a whole other topic. But basically, not all that is gold glitters. And I think that's a good sense of what the CIA is. They do good work, of course. But to me, because the work they do is so vague and in the shadows, sometimes the actual goal is hard to define. And sometimes you wonder, is it groupthink or the mission that is sometimes more important than actually making sure you're doing what's right and clarifying to the American public what is right. And sometimes these methods are hard to justify. We've seen through torture programs during Iraq, etc. Like I said, I could go on all day. But basically, the Felix Leiter and James Bond is not particularly what the CIA is doing all the time, which obviously sounds like a stupid statement for me to say, but I'm more just clarifying to myself or anything. I don't know. But anyways, the reason why I'm going here is because over the last couple decades, there's been a huge decline in public support for the CIA. And I don't even know if decline in public support is the right way to say it. I think it's more like people are willing to question the motives of some of them overseas because it's so clandestine, and it seems to lead to furthering U.S. goals, overseeing how the world works together. And I think this is kind of inevitable with the age of leaks, technology, and just social media and transparency. For example, in 2017, WikiLeaks published more than 8,000 documents on the CIA. Documents, I don't know why I said documents. This dated from 2013 to 2016, where it said they basically had software capabilities that they could compromise cars, smart TVs, web browsers, operating systems of smartphones. Basically, like if it has technology and it's considered like a smart TV or a smart refrigerator, the CIA could actually have access to it, which I don't think a lot of Americans love. You know, in 2009, there was a congressional hearing where it was found that the CIA was not disclosing everything to Congress, which I guess they don't actually technically have to, but there should be some transparency between lawmakers and intelligence communities. And I even saw that there was a CIA page about the Iraq War in an English Wikipedia site that was changed or doctored. And, you know, you could go into the Cold War era. You could go into MK Ultra. You could definitely put on your tinfoil hat, which I don't like to do because most people wearing tinfoil hats are not correct and they just like conspiracies. But all of this to me is to say that the CIA is not perfect. And it backs up, I think, the view, especially amongst the more conspiratorial Americans, that the U.S. is meddling in other countries' affairs, and the CIA is kind of the poster child for that. And this all leads to this main topic. There was a kind of breathtaking and groundbreaking article that came out of the New York Times last week that talked about some memos and cables that came out from the CIA last week. So basically, there's a really good article that came out last week from the New York Times. I think it came out about 5 days ago at the time of this recording. And it references, in quotes here, counterintelligence officials said in a top-secret cable to all stations and bases around the world that too many of the people it recruits from other countries to spy for the U.S. are being lost. And this article is by Julian E. Barnes and Adam Goldman. And so basically the article is saying that the CIA is worried that a lot of the informants they use for information in a said country are being lost. And they are saying being lost. And I will clarify that lost is a very nice term. More specifically, I think the CIA is admitting that informants are being captured, killed, and or compromised. In what order, it may vary, which is also terrifying in some ways. The report looked at dozens of cases where informants had either been compromised or killed over the last few years. And apparently this is something semi-new because informants usually aren't compromised, or at least it's less likely that they're to be compromised. And the cable, again here in quotes, highlights that. The struggle the spy agency is having is that it works to recruit spies around the world in difficult operating environments. In recent years, adversarial intelligence services in countries like Russia, China, Iran, and Pakistan have been hunting down the CIA's sources, and in some cases turning them into double agents. The cable also mentions something a bit more troubling. I mean, the whole thing is troubling, but it also said that the CIA was basically doing a bad job of vetting their informants. So it's not only that they're losing informants that are being compromised, but also maybe they didn't even get the right informants in the first place, which might have led to the subsequent events. They underestimated foreign counter surveillance in Iran as well. They were too trusting of sources that hadn't been vetted enough, and also they were very willing to recruit without looking at risks. The cable basically says that the agency focused on the mission over security, and I want to highlight that, and I'll probably highlight it again and again, is it seems like the problem with the CIA is that they are very focused on doing what they view as right in a very vague and gray sphere of intelligence. They're not out in the open, and they are recruiting now people that maybe they haven't done their due diligence to check. And so to me it looks like the CIA, basically this cable is saying the CIA has lost a step in global intelligence. I'll just say right here, like off the bat, that it's not really surprising to me. I feel like for a long time this has been an issue. The mission, what is the mission? How do we accomplish the mission? Security comes later. reporting back to Washington comes later. I just think of Iraq, our involvement in coups around the world, for example. You act first, question later. And I guess it makes sense to me if you have a questionable source who potentially you can bring in to help you. I guess you'd rather further your funding and further your mission before you actually look at maybe, is this person reliable and reputable? The article even mentions that in Iran and China, some intelligence officials believe that Americans provided information to these agencies that are obviously adversaries to us. There's one person, Monica Witt, a former Air Force sergeant who actually defected to Iran and was indicted on a charge of providing information to Tehran in 2019. And I guess the Iranians leveraged her knowledge only after determining that she could be trusted. Later, there was Jerry Shungshin Lee, who was a former CIA agent as well. He was sentenced to 19 years in prison for providing secrets to the Chinese government. So, right off the bat, my question mainly is, are we checking these people? Are we getting actually the best that are willing to work with us, or are we just finding convenient sources that might backfire later? And it seems like the latter, unfortunately. And so other than these notable defectors that I mentioned, the article also mentions that this demonstrates in many ways how other countries are kind of catching up to us in terms of technological advances. It mentions how innovations like biometric scans, facial recognition, artificial intelligence, and hacking tools to just track the movements of officers, in the CIA that is, have made it quite easy for them to track the sources, right? 30 years ago, 20 years ago, it'd be really hard to actually use technology to track potentially a double agent or an informant or the movements of the CIA, but now it's easy. I think what this highlights is that while the CIA does use technology as well, obviously they do, they still rely on boots on the ground informants and boots on the ground surveillance. I think that's kind of intrinsic to the the CIA, is that while other branches, like the NSA, for example, are more reliant on actual data intelligence and surveillance in the terms of data, like what are you saying over WhatsApp or iMessage, the CIA actually needs tangible boots on the ground resources. And that is worrying that other countries are able to track this better, because I think it kind of puts a wrench in the whole system of how the CIA operates. I don't know enough about the CIA, but I'm guessing or just asking openly, maybe they need to reform this process, because if other countries can now track them, spy on potential double agents, spy on informants, then the whole process is not working. There's an ex-CIA operative named Douglas London who's mentioned in this article, and he has a new book called The Recruiter Spying and the Lost Art of American Intelligence, which sounds like a really good book, by the way. I'm going to have to read it. I have not read it yet. And basically, this book argues that the CIA's shift towards covert action and paramilitary operations undermined their traditional espionage. Their traditional espionage relied on securely, and securely is a key term here. It securely relied on recruiting and handling agents. So to me, this sounds like they're kind of taking half-assed measures to get the job done. And they have a work culture that doesn't seem to strive for accountability. Obviously, the world's changing, don't get me wrong. But also, it seems like the CIA just isn't double-checking enough. And for an agency that is putting out such intelligence that dictates policy, especially foreign policy, it's important that they're accountable for the information they bring. And for an agency with all this data, all this clout in DC, and all this power, they need to be more careful. I just finished a really interesting book called Reign of Terror: How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump, by Spencer Ackerman. And it's a really, really fascinating book. I can't recommend it enough. Probably one of the best books so far I've read this year, to be honest. But the book really does mention how the war on terror just literally broke our intelligence community, radicalized our politics, and showed kind of our lack of cultural understanding in foreign policy when working with other nations. The book mentions that after the Cold War, for example, we really did change our intelligence tactics and purely focused on Islamic extremism, for example, which would make sense after 9/11. And some of this was warranted, obviously, but a lot of it wasn't, So basically what the book highlights is that we focused all of our attempts and a lot of our intelligence and a lot of our resources on stopping Islamic terrorism, whether homegrown or abroad. But the problem is we vaguely defined the enemy, but also ignored other rising threats. Other rising threats would be involving extremism in the U.S., the growth of domestic terrorism, which was usually not Islamic, but more white. This also involved a growing Russian cyber terrorism threat, a growing China, and so much more. Iran is another one. And so basically we were so focused on the war on terrorism that we kind of ignored a lot of other threats. And this kind of goes into what I've felt about the Cold War in general, is kind of that the U.S. has missed a step. And we politically changed, obviously. I don't have to tell anyone that. But what I mean here is that really since World War II, you had World War II into the Cold War. And both of these conflicts kind of produced an external threat for the U.S. It kept us unified and working towards a common goal. We never talked about our internal differences because there was something bigger that we needed to combat. Like, for example, as bad as maybe internal politics were and how divided things were becoming, we could still agree that the Soviet Union was a bigger threat. But unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, obviously it was good, I think the Soviet Union fell. But once the Soviet Union was gone, we seemed to have very different views of how the country should work, and all of our differences, inequalities, and issues just seemed to come to the surface from there. But on the international front, things changed as well. And I think that's what this article is highlighting. My theory is that while the U.S. was still justifying military budgets to fund the previous wars, and while we flexed our might in Kuwait or wherever else, countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, there were other countries like Iran, Russia, and even groups like ISIS who knew that they couldn't beat us through ground war, right? Their tanks, jets, fighters would actually never beat us on the ground. So they focused on other methods. They were mainly focused on cyber terrorism, as well as new misinformation used through social media. ISIS recruited online. Russian hackers meddled in democracy across the world. And now we see both of these kind of commonplace in the world, right? And I don't think the U.S. is caught up. This seemed to work, honestly, because the CIA, the military, national intelligence, we focused on old means for defense and security, the boots-on-the-ground approach. But we didn't invest enough in cybersecurity, technological infrastructure. And now maybe we're paying for it. That's truly what I think here, is that we just didn't do enough to keep up with everyone else who needed an alternative to find information on us. And so that New York Times article actually echoes these thoughts. In quotes here, it says, "The agency has devoted much of its attention for the last 2 decades on terrorist threats and on conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. But improving intelligence collection on adversarial powers, both great and small, is once again a centerpiece of the CIA's agenda, particularly as policymakers demand more insight into China and Russia." And I think that's the big thing here, is that we were actually kind of ignoring other threats. And by other threats, I mean bigger threats. We just weren't focused on places like China that are not only a military threat to the United States, but also just a threat to the idea of democracy and human rights. Last week, I was actually lucky enough to see a panel of speakers at the University of Chicago, and one of them was Michael Morell. He served as the deputy director of the CIA from 2010 to 2013, and twice he was the acting director, first in 2011 and then from 2012 to 2013. He was also, prior to 9/11 and during 9/11 and after 9/11, he was part of the daily briefing for President Bush, George W. that is, and he experienced a lot during this period, I'm sure. And he was really good in this panel. He mentioned that Bush and everyone else probably thought they were doing the right thing, and Iraq and just the 9/11 events posed a very unique threat to the U.S., because if you don't do anything or if you don't do enough, it's on you. So as the leader, you want to do enough. But he also mentions that, that 9/11 really broke us, and our response to 9/11 really broke us. And, obviously I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but I do remember Morell during this panel mentioned that, the U.S., especially our intelligence community, has lost credibility since 9/11. We have to remember that after 9/11, we were easily able to mobilize a global coalition. And that was based on sometimes faulty, sometimes good intelligence coming out of our intelligence agencies. But he mentions that if there was an issue with, say, Taiwan or China right now, or I guess more specifically, China in Taiwan, that he doesn't think we would actually have the mobilization of intelligence and or the cooperation to be a tangible reaction. And that kind of brings me to what I want to talk about next here. And it relates directly to the Taiwan and China thing. Because it looks like we could be close to something that is sub-beneficial for the U.S. and the world, and even Chinese people, in terms of the escalating tensions between Taiwan and China, and I guess the U.S. indirectly. Because I was reading today in preparation for this podcast that The Hill has reported that China says it's carried out beach landing drills in or near Taiwan. And this is just amid all these growing and escalating tensions between Taiwan and China. And, this is nothing new. It should be noted that China really appears to think that they have claim to Taiwan, and over the last year they keep encroaching. According to Reuters, there was a video that showed Chinese military personnel throwing smoke grenades, navigating around barbed wire, doing boat drills off the coast of Taiwan. So to me it seems like they're at least showing escalation, or they want at least the guise of escalation. We'll see, how much that actually goes, but clearly China's trying to make some sort of impact. They're trying to send a message to us in some ways. And this recent Hill article and these recent actions by China, they're really just piggybacking in a lot of ways off of the escalating rhetoric that we've experienced between Taiwan and China in recent months. What I mean here is that Taiwan has time and time again expressed that they would like to defend themselves if necessary, and they don't want to be part of China. Beijing, of course, has responded by weirdly saying that the two places will have this peaceful reunification. I find that hard to believe. If Taiwan doesn't want to be part of China and they said they'll defend themselves, I don't know how a peaceful reunification happens, but that's what China's saying. Again, probably all bullshit. I don't know. To make things even more interesting, I guess if interesting is the word we want to use, October 1st was China's national holiday, and over the last week since October 1st, they've been showing force and testing Taiwan. I think it's a signal to the West, to be completely honest. A few days ago, China flew, I think it was 56 warplanes over Taiwan's aerial defenses. This is according to Reuters. This led to Taiwan trying to respond in image, but their military is just far behind China's. But the U.S. also called out China during this, basically saying that China's challenging the region's stability, which is true. But I mean, my question is, and I guess there's probably two outcomes to this, is like, why is China doing this unless they want to invade or take over Taiwan? And to me, it's either they're flexing to the West or flexing to the U.S. and trying to send a symbolic message, or they actually do think that they can rightfully take Taiwan and now is the opportune time. And to me, this is a very worrying event, at least in the making. And why, you may ask? Well, we're kind of seeing the perfect culmination of factors. And let me try and just explain, because I think this is one of those times in history where maybe the island of Taiwan could be the catalyst for something bigger. The reason I mainly think that this is a perfect culmination of events that could lead to a perfect storm is that, first, the U.S. is constantly, and has been experiencing this for the last decade, a decline in influence, not only around the world, but a lot of Asia, and especially Southeast Asia. We still have bases in South Korea, and we are still close with Japan, and actually are involved in their foreign policy a lot. But the world is changing, and China does seem to want to fill these gaps. And I've talked before about Africa. China's doing a great job with the Belt and Road Initiative there. But the bigger thing is that I think one of the issues with Trump's rhetoric was that this nativist populism wanted to bring everything back to America. And the problem is that when you have a growing world power and you have the U.S. trying to maintain their power, you don't want to leave places that are influential, but also agree with you on human rights and maybe your view of the world. So the U.S., I think, is also in some ways with their back against a wall, I guess would be the best way to put it, is that China is encroaching in places that used to be seen as, reputable U.S. allies, I guess. And that being said, I also think China's worried. The pandemic was really successful in getting people to focus on China, especially in the West. I actually don't really know in the neighboring countries to China, how the view was during the pandemic. But I think a lot of the West really was able to focus on some of the downfalls of a Chinese superpower. I think ex-President Trump actually did a good job of focusing on China and bringing attention to China when previous administrations, right or left, were not able to. I think that was the importance of Trump's rhetoric, is that he actually flipped the entire message on China. It was less, okay, we're going to bring capitalism to China and hope they adopt. It was more like, okay, capitalism's already in China, and they are not adopting democracy. Now the protectionism I don't agree with, because I think a lot of the supply chain shortages that we're seeing are part of that. But I do like his hesitance towards China. And it seems like a lot of the world has followed, right? We have the UK, Australia, and the US all working together to combat Chinese influence. Australia has been hit very hard by Chinese sanctions and boycotts. And Huawei, for example, a big Chinese tech firm, has seen significant declines in mobile phone technology, mobile phone sales. And that's because of a lot of bans in places like the UK and the US. People are putting a spotlight on Huawei. And even Southeast Asia, too, has started to push back on China. And so that's the problem, though. I think China knows they need to act. This is, I think, what has made China a bit more nervous. Xi Jinping, as well, is not a spring chicken. He's not a young bull. And I'm sure he's thinking about his legacy. I believe he's in his late 60s. I don't have it in front of me, but I want to say he's about 66, 67. And he knows he's not going to be in power forever. Yes, he's created a system that doesn't have a successor, which is a whole other problem once he does leave power. But I bet he's more willing to do something bold because he wants it in his legacy. Legacy is key, especially when you're a one-party rule like China. Unitary systems like that are really good at big goals. So I kind of see Xi Jinping seeing Taiwan as maybe the last thing he could do to solidify his legacy, I guess. And the other problem, which I think all of the previous problems culminate into, is that Taiwan is going to be the front line between a growing schism between the U.S. and China. There's no lie here that China and the U.S. are probably at their worst point between each other. The escalation is unprecedented. You have COVID, the trade wars, just difference in ideology that have kind of all culminated in this. And I worry that Taiwan could be the breaking point. And historically, it's usually some small place that leads to greater escalation. What also worries me here is that China has been testing the waters for a long time. You know, we saw in Hong Kong how even with protest movements, international condemnation, basically China was still able to muddle democracy and roll over democracy because they still had substantial power there. And so I think for China, it was a good test on how they can still control Hong Kong, even if the actual people in Hong Kong don't want it. And let's be honest, social media in the U.S. was angry at China about what happened in Hong Kong and the violence against the protesting movements that have happened subsequently, every couple months for the last couple of years. But nothing's actually been done on a global scale. And so I think China knows that they could probably get away with something. You know, China's a highly effective police state that has used technology to further their autocratic regime better than anything I've ever seen. And they would be better equipped to get involved in Taiwan as well, I think. Right now, I think there's a hesitance towards China growing in the U.S., and I can just see in my mind the Tom Cottons being fine with some sort of war. And I think a lot of people don't understand how bad that could actually be if it escalated. I hope by then we could maybe see some de-escalation, but it just doesn't seem like particularly optimistic at this point. I've seen some solutions. Foreign Policy and CNN had mentioned some. And I think one of the ideas is not escalating the conflict, but this is obviously a problem of who blinks first, right? And so what if we already had a troop presence, and I mean the U.S., what if we already had a troop presence in Taiwan? China would have to blink first. If American troops are already in Taiwan, and I'm sure the Taiwanese would be fine with that, as long as there's some sort of sunset clause. China would be less willing to actually do a military operation because they know that they would be the ones firing the first shot. The problem right now is we don't have that. And so we need to not just keep escalating rhetoric with China. We need to either have boots on the ground in China or at least a small force on the ground in China so it disincentivizes China from reacting to that. Or we need to at least give the Taiwanese technology and arms. And you're probably thinking, Alex, this sounds exactly like the Cold War. This is not the Cold War. Like, times are very different. But there's some truth to it, is that we need to incentivize the Taiwanese to be willing to stand up for what they value. Because we have to remember that Taiwan and China are very culturally separated at this point. Since the Communist Revolution, they have been completely on different trajectories. And just on a human rights basis, I don't think we want China imposing what they view as correct in a country that has not viewed it the same way for a long time. So I think the U.S. would be best to not, call for some military intervention, but to send people there and at least have a troop presence there so China is forced to act, and that's on the record. Again, I'm not trying to scare people. I don't think we're getting to a point like that yet. But I hope people in Washington and around the world are thinking, how do we disincentivize China from being more bold in Taiwan? So yeah, the reason why I mainly mention this is because, let's be honest, everyone's kind of on the edge right now. And usually when you're on the edge, good things don't come out of it. I think mainly because of the pandemic and a lot of the protectionist policies around the world, we have seen an issue with supply chain that have both hurt China and the United States. And I think both actors are a little bit walking around on eggshells, which is not usually good for global communication, I guess, or peace. But anyways, I want to cover one last issue before we're out of here, and it's also international. And it's about Ethiopia. And it's about that just atrocious crisis that has gone from just a humanitarian crisis to probably a civil war, I think would be the best way to describe it, to what some people, including the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, would call a genocide. Back a year ago on the old podcast, we did an episode when this first happened, or when this conflict first began. And also I'm working on a paper right now about it. It's in the editorial process, but you guys know how think tanks can work sometimes. But anyways, just a little background for people who don't know. Ethiopia is a country that has a multitude of different ethnic groups, and they have a lot of autonomous regions there. And basically, actually, the central government's done a pretty good job of giving them some form of autonomy in terms of regional elections and how they run their affairs inside of their regions, because obviously you have different religious and ethnic groups that just view the world differently. So in a country like that, you need some form of, I guess, decentralized governance. But the problem here is that since the 90s, there have been tensions between two groups. And that's the People's Liberation Front from Tigray, which is the region that is experiencing now this humanitarian crisis. And they've always been a little bit more on the Marxist, progressive side. And then you have the Oromos, which are a big ethnic group that currently are led by Abiy Ahmed, who is the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, who, by the way, won the Nobel Peace Prize very recently. I think it was in 2019. It was one of the two. And so you have a ethnic group who has issues with another ethnic group, but one of the ethnic groups is actually governing the country. And so what happened here is that usually regional elections don't need to be watched over by the central government. But last September of 2020, Tigray defied the federal government, I guess, and held a regional election. And usually the government would kind of let this slide, from what I've gathered. But this time they didn't, and they deemed the election illegal, and they sent in a general to help, I guess, talk to them. I don't actually understand what was specifically the purpose of sending him there, but he was barred. He was barred from entering, and then there were just reports of Tigrayan soldiers arming up, young men arming up, and it looked like an escalating conflict. So, of course, what happened is that Abiy Ahmed decided to order his forces to hit back. And since this escalation, the crisis has turned very violent and tragic. It's become a refugee crisis, as Sudan and Eritrea, who are neighbors to Ethiopia, have been pulled into the crisis. And Tigrayans have fled, and thousands have been killed. There's reports of mass rape. And I've heard the word genocide thrown around a lot. and there's violent clashes, military violence, and that's what led Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State for the U.S. under Biden, to call this a genocide. He first said humanitarian crisis, but then also did voice genocide. I do think it's important to say that there are no good actors in this. There's like whenever you look at a sectarian and ethnic divide like this, you can't really just say it's black and white. But the problem is that the Tigray region is very poor and lacks a lot of resources, and they're in a very, very dry region. To be completely honest, they rely on aid. And unfortunately, it looks like aid has become somewhat of a political football. And so there's a great article here called "As Crisis Deepens in Ethiopia, the Need for Committed Diplomatic Responses Grow." And it's by Michelle Gavin. And it just talks about just the mass murder and rape. And of course, this is coming from the leadership of a man who won the Nobel Peace Prize. So that's a whole other conversation. But The Economist talks about how actually since these recent reports, because they just put out an article this week talking about how things are still getting worse. And there's new reports actually from a year ago in this town called Axum, where Eritrean troops were just basically fighting alongside Ethiopian forces, and they murdered civilians. Men, boys, they even shot people in the back and gunned down people as they came out of the church. And this is all interesting to me is because the reason why Abiy Ahmed won the Nobel Peace Prize was due to his basically brokering of a peace deal with Eritrea after years and years, or probably decades of civil war. I mean, not civil war, a war with Eritrea. There's still mines that, like, no one can actually walk out in these certain regions because there are still just mines everywhere. And so he did a good job of brokering a form of peace. But now it's really nefarious because the Eritreans are disguising as aid workers. They're disposing of aid. They're helping the Ethiopian government against the Tigrayans. And it just poses the question of what does the international community do here? Because you have transnational actors. Do you sanction Eritrea? And then they just do a black market trade with Ethiopia? Do you sanction Abiy Ahmed's government? And then the Eritreans keep doing it? Again, sanctions also just hurt people, not governments. So it gets really complicated. But like I do think that there needs to be accountability, because The Economist mentions that since July, the Tigrayan region has only received a fraction of the food needed to keep its 6 million inhabitants alive. I was reading a report where it's been determined by aid agencies in the region that about 100 trucks of food and supplies are needed daily to enter the region. But there's a rough estimate that says that about 10% is currently going in there. Where are these supplies going? I don't know, but it's not enough. And like aid, resources like food should not be used as a political football. The last time something like this happened, there was a famine in Ethiopia that happened in the 80s that killed between 400 and 700,000 people. And the projections I've seen have said that this could be the same if we don't do something about it soon. To make it even worse, the African Union, what I actually think is a great organization that in the long run might actually unify Africa and help them find a pan-African approach to dealing with continental problems, they've tried to come and talk to Abiy Ahmed without much success. The former presidents of Liberia, Mozambique, and South Africa all met with him, just hoping to find a peaceful resolution or at least conversation. But he said they could not meet any Tigrayan officials because they are an enemy group fighting inside of Tigray. Okay, you can dislike them, you can disagree with them, but they're still in your country. And as a leader of a country, you have a mandate to work with everybody. But that's not what's happening. And this Mr. Peace Prize winner here is doing the opposite. He's not allowing talks, and it seems like he's intensifying the situation. Again, there's not enough reports coming out of Tigray to give a counter or to give him the benefit of the doubt. But when I see people starving and mass killings and rape, I just can't see how the Ahmad government is on the right side of this. And I bet you're wondering, like, how do we fix this? What can we do? And there's been a lot of solutions thrown out, but a lot of them haven't really gone anywhere. back in March of 2021, the EU suspended about 88 million euros worth of aid to Ethiopia. But again, what does that do? America's also threatened to impose financial sanctions on people implicated in war crimes. But how do you quantify that? How do you classify that? How do you deal with that? And also recently, the UN, side note, the UN has actually had officials kicked out of the country, which is never good. But the UN Security Council is also talking about sanctioning them as well. But there's another nagging problem, is that Russia and China voted against it. They're siding with Ethiopia. Obviously, China has financial ties in a lot of Africa, Ethiopia as well, and Russia doesn't seem to care much. So, of course, we're seeing these two actors come out of it. China has shown, obviously, that human rights are not their key agenda. It's about money, cooperation, and loyalty, influence, and Russia is Russia. So, again, we have these nefarious actors, in my opinion, stopping this. So the EU is going to pull out aid. The U.S. has talked about financial sanctions, and the UN is being stonewalled by nefarious actors. So I don't particularly know what's next here. I guess in a perfect world, you could call for grassroots movements, but what type of grassroots movement is going to come out of a country that's been decimated, and this Tigrayan region doesn't even have enough water, food, and medical aid? I guess one solution I've seen out of Foreign Policy and The Economist, which are both great publications here, which I recommend everyone to read if you haven't, but they argue that the IMF is a huge loaner to Ethiopia. They give a lot of emergency loans to Ethiopia, and its forbearance on loans depends on the influence of America and Europe. So could America and Europe influence the IMF to not be a creditor to Ethiopia, potentially? But again, I think that would just hurt the day-to-day lives of people there. I don't think it would actually stop Abiy Ahmed. Maybe there'd be enough pressure for him to change his course, but I just don't know. So I wish I had a rosy answer for you guys here, but I don't. But I do think that maybe we need to be a little less trigger happy on giving out these Nobel Peace Prizes to leaders like Xu in Myanmar or Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia. I think on the global scale, sometimes we classify certain leaders as good because they did something that's better for the common good of the world. But sometimes we don't look at the specific problems in a country. Like Xi in Myanmar, she's been disposed. The genocide of the Rohingya Muslim population continues, and there was a military coup earlier in the summer. And Abiy Ahmed is blocking aid and seems to be in cahoots with the Eritrean militia, basically, to cause somewhat of a cultural genocide. Are these the people that should be put up on a pedestal as Nobel Peace winners? I don't think so. Again, I wish I had a better solution for you guys. I really do, but I don't. But I just wanted to shine some light on this because it's just a growing issue that I wish a year out there'd be a solution, but it just seems like it's getting worse. And I think the reason why I want to highlight all of this is because as divided we are in the U.S., I think we need to remember that there are bigger problems out there. There are serious problems in the world, and a lot of the problems we're now facing aren't domestic or focused on one nation, one region, one continent. They're global issues. Injustice in one place is injustice everywhere. And we just need to keep that in mind. So anyways, we're on Apple Podcasts, Podbean, iTunes, YouTube, the Google, the Safari, all those things. So let me know your thoughts. I'll be back on Thursday. Take care, guys. Thank you.